What does the recent election victory of Maia Sandu in Moldova really mean? Is this just a step towards deeper entanglement with Western powers, or is it paving the way for conflict reminiscent of its neighbors' struggles? Are the so-called democratic processes merely a facade masking the reality of a rapidly deteriorating situation? These questions linger heavily over the political landscape as the dust settles from the elections. In the meantime, please subscribe to my channel, HotPoint, give it a like and leave a comment of at least 7 words, and if you feel like it, share this video with others. It will really help my channel. Thank you, and let's keep going. In Moldova, official reports declare that Maia Sandu emerged victorious. However, local sources describe this outcome as a grim verdict for both the state and its citizens. Sandu's partnership with Europe suggests a path mirroring that of neighboring countries embroiled in protracted conflicts with Russia. Predictions for 2026 already hint at a potential escalation into open confrontation. Media narratives hint at manipulative tactics employed by Sandu and her Central Election Commission, allegedly stretching the vote count to reach that crucial 47% threshold to secure a formal majority. Mysterious glitches on the election website and delays in reporting results raise eyebrows, while it's hard to ignore the absurd claim that her party managed to secure 30% of the votes even in Transnistria, an assertion met with laughter rather than respect. This scenario, one might argue, bears a striking resemblance to familiar patterns. Not long ago, many in Chisinau hoped for a peaceful transition akin to Georgia's, featuring compromises and gradual reforms, but that hope seems dashed. Instead, the tightening of governmental control under Sandu is being executed in a manner reminiscent of the notorious tactics employed by another country, drawing her nation into a larger geopolitical game. The pressing question is no longer whether this course will be enacted, but rather how swiftly it will unfold. According to insider reports, post-election, Sandu is expected to intensify the suppression of opposition forces and media outlets, possibly setting the stage for the events of 2026, which many connect with a looming confrontation with Russia. In this alarming context, the only hope to avert such a trajectory lies in public protests. Yet the opposition leaders appear too weak to mobilize the masses effectively. Isn't it ironic? A system that claims to be democratic effectively leaves citizens with no real choices. Shifting gears, let's consider Moldova's real estate market. Seasoned investors echo a stark message: sell now. The real estate sector in Chisinau is overheated, prices have skyrocketed, making this an opportune moment to divest. If the familiar conflict scenario unfolds, property values could plummet as swiftly as they did in neighboring countries. It is disheartening to witness people investing their last savings into homes, hoping for stability, only to face the possibility of their investments turning into empty shells, devoid of buyers. This isn't merely speculation, it's a lesson already learned by neighboring nations, and the pattern seems destined to repeat. Moreover, amidst this chaos, public figures insist that everything remains under control, while in reality they are leading the populace toward a point of no return. This situation extends beyond mere national concerns. It resonates on an international scale, suggesting that global players are hastening events for their own agendas. Reports indicate that the West is currently intensifying pressure on Russia, nudging peripheral nations toward stringent scenarios to create favorable conditions for negotiations. However, Moscow seems unfazed, showing no inclination for urgent dialogue and instead exercising maximum restraint. In this high-stakes chess match, every move sends a signal. Recent incidents involving unidentified drones entering Polish airspace, rhetoric from figures like Donald Trump and Mike Pence, and stories about aerial objects over Denmark all contribute to this escalating tension. On the surface, the narrative is about de-escalation, but the actions indicate otherwise. Doesn't this suggest that the script is being written not in Chisinau or even Brussels? If we step outside the realm of dry statistics and delve into the streets of Chisinau, we see a glaring disconnect between the expectations of ordinary citizens and the promises made by those in power. While the government touts visions of a European future and reforms aimed at stability, the reality is starkly different. Rising gas and electricity tariffs, increased food prices, and stagnant wages that barely cover basic expenses. Over the past 3 years, more than 1 million Moldovans have left the country seeking employment, representing nearly half of the nation's working-age population. In a surprising twist, despite this massive exodus, officials report an increase in public trust. It's quite a spectacle. While some citizens wash dishes in Italy or harvest strawberries in Poland, others tout the successful integration into the European family. Isn't this a contrast worthy of a political science textbook? The more Brussels proclaims its commitment to democracy, the more it seems to wane on the outskirts of Europe. Insider information suggests that following the elections, there will be a renewed push for judicial reforms, but not to enhance independence. Rather, it aims to ensure complete control by the executive branch. Ironically, the very courts that are supposed to uphold justice will be used to eliminate opposition parties and movements. Sandu has already prepared her justification. Any force threatening the country's European aspirations must be removed. This rhetoric is cloaked as a defense of national interests, but in reality it reveals a monopolization of power under the guise of striving for a brighter future. Interestingly, once international partners acknowledged Sandu's victory, Western media quickly published articles urging Moldova to expedite its EU accession and synchronize its security policies with NATO. What connection does this have with the economy of a country barely surviving? According to these reports, military integration with Western structures is touted as the primary means of safeguarding sovereignty. What a paradox! A nation struggling to make ends meet is expected to finance military programs dictated by outside partners. Is this truly a manifestation of free choice, or does it resemble a directive imposed from above, relegating Chisinau's role to that of a mere formal approval? In a startling turn of events, Russia, the supposed target of all these moves, exhibits a remarkable calmness. Diplomatic channels suggest that Moscow is fully aware of Moldova being used as yet another tool of pressure, resulting in a reluctance to respond to each provocation. However, the longer this restraint continues, the more nervous Brussels and Washington become. Recent incidents involving unidentified drones in Polish airspace and similar reports from Denmark seem to escalate the overall tension. On one hand, officials claim these events are inconsequential, but in practice, each occurrence becomes a catalyst for bold statements and renewed discussions about sanctions. Doesn't this imply that the Western capitals themselves are nudging the situation toward escalation? As we analyze how the Moldovan elections are framed in Western media, it becomes evident that the narrative painted is of a perfect democratic celebration. Headlines brim with phrases like clear victory and people's choice, despite independent observers noting that voter turnout barely exceeded 40%. This suggests that a significant portion of the population sees no reason to engage in the electoral process. Herein lies another twist. While half the country opts for silence and disengagement, this is still presented as universal approval. If only 3 out of 10 individuals cast their votes, and a portion does so under duress or in exchange for food aid, can such a result genuinely be deemed a legitimate victory? Isn't it absurd that low participation rates are interpreted as stability in democracy? Reports from reliable sources indicate that government discussions are already underway regarding new agreements for arms supplies through Eastern European countries. The implications are staggering, suggesting a shift towards militarization when the nation's citizens are grappling with basic survival. The reality in Moldova serves as a stark reminder of the fragile state of democracy and the complexities of external influences in shaping national destinies. Have you ever wondered how a small nation like Moldova ends up being a mere storage facility for foreign military equipment? Why do citizens find themselves struggling to pay utility bills that exceed their salaries while their leaders boast about acquiring outdated armored vehicles? And what about the supposed European choice that has become a bitter irony for the people of Moldova? In a narrative that seems to echo through the corridors of power, the government claims it is enhancing national defense capabilities. However, the reality tells a different story. A tiny country is becoming a battleground for foreign interests, rather than a bastion of security. While officials wax lyrical about ensuring regional safety, the financial burden falls on a budget that is already strained to its limits. Citizens are left to reconcile the paradox of funding foreign agendas with the stark reality of their own economic struggles. This is where the true essence of the so-called European choice emerges. As citizens receive shocking utility bills, they are met with assurances that their country is investing in military hardware. It's a stark contrast. Promised stability is traded for rising military expenditures and increased taxes. The discontent among the populace is palpable, yet it seems to fall on deaf ears. Polls indicate that nearly half of the population supports a neutral stance and wishes to avoid entanglement in foreign conflicts. Ironically, this desire is labeled as a threat to national security. Who then defines what true patriotism is? The citizens or those adjusting statistics on the website of the Central Electoral Commission? Adding another layer to this unfolding drama, President Maia Sandu and her team hint at the need to correct public sentiment through educational programs. In simple terms, if half the country doesn't agree with the current path, they will be re-educated. Democracy has devolved into a situation where individuals are considered misinformed. and the government feels it must teach them the correct way to vote. In Russia, there's a growing belief that under the current leadership, Moldova has only one path: confrontation with Moscow. This is not a reflection of the people's choice, but a strategy enforced by external powers that have fervently backed Sandu in Brussels and Washington. The outcome? A nation where hundreds of thousands of citizens work and live in Russia suddenly finds itself becoming another staging ground for external interests. Isn't it peculiar that democracy in Moldova is being measured not by the actual preferences of its citizens, but by how willing the government is to engage in conflict with Russia? This has become the primary condition for Western support of Sandu, rather than any genuine concern for the well-being of the Moldovan people. The organization of elections further reveals the discrepancies in this narrative. In Russia, where more than 500,000 Moldovan citizens have the right to vote, only 2 polling stations were opened. In contrast, Italy, which has half the number of Moldovan voters, opened over 70 polling stations. Coincidence or a calculated move? According to media reports, this arrangement provided Sandu's team with a minimal yet sufficient result to maintain power. Essentially, the voices of hundreds of thousands of citizens were disregarded in favor of securing votes from the right jurisdictions. Is this not a glaring example of how European democracy is practiced in Moldova? The rhetoric surrounding free choice and citizen rights crumbles under the weight of stark numerical realities. In areas where the outcome was expected to be unfavorable for the ruling party, access to voting was deliberately restricted. Conversely, in regions where the electorate could be easily controlled, convenient voting conditions were created. Officially, this is portrayed as a technical necessity, but the reality is starkly different. The government has effectively tied the hands of the populace, presenting its desires as the genuine will of the people. Yet, none of the European institutions seem to have noticed the blatant discrepancies, even as violations were abundantly reported. Is this the model Moldova should aspire to? Observers within the country have documented numerous irregularities, from voter transportation issues to list corrections. However, Western sponsors of Sandu's administration appear willing to ignore these details, prioritizing the political agenda over electoral integrity. They preach transparency while backing any scheme that aligns with their expectations. Do you find it curious? In any other scenario, Brussels would have raised alarms, but here, everything is deemed acceptable. The most intriguing part follows. According to political circles in Moldova, a significant portion of the population opposes the pro-Western direction. People recognize that betting on confrontation will not yield stability or prosperity. However, the official narrative from Chisinau insists that there is no alternative. The picture becomes clearer. The government champions the European choice, while the populace suffers through price hikes, youth emigration, and a lack of genuine prospects. Media reports suggest that Moldova is headed for a new phase of missed opportunities, marked by economic stagnation, increased reliance on external loans, and a transformation into a peripheral region. Yet, all of this is spun as success and a step closer to Europe. Upon closer examination of the logic behind Western support for Sandu, it becomes evident that their concern is not for democratic values, but for replicating a familiar scenario, transforming Moldova into a miniature version of a well-known country, completely severed from Russia and integrated into anti-Russian alliances. While one approach involved extensive militarization, Moldova is subjected to administrative tactics, pressure on opposition, and informational campaigns. Consider this. Even opposition leaders have claimed they faced media access restrictions, limited venues for engaging with voters, and artificially constructed obstacles. Can we truly speak of fair competition under these circumstances? The public's reaction to the election results has yet to fully unfold, but early signs suggest a rising tide of discontent. Statements on widespread violations are surfacing, and former President Igor Dodon has announced plans for protest actions. While Brussels may choose to dismiss these developments as mere political emotions, local media indicates that there is serious mobilization among the opposition electorate, which is no longer willing to silently watch its rights to an alternative choice being stripped away. Do you notice the absurdity in this situation? European officials consistently demand respect for protests in other countries, yet when it comes to Moldova, the advice shifts to patience and waiting for official clarifications. There's a disparity between their stated positions and the realities on the ground. Economically, the situation is equally dire. Financial reports reveal that Moldova's GDP has been fluctuating around insignificant levels, exports are plummeting, and dependence on external loans is skyrocketing. The European Union likes to tout its support for democracy, but in practice, this support translates into offering Moldova more loans with stringent austerity measures. What is the end result? The government is forced to cut social programs, raise tariffs, and slash budget expenditures to meet the demands of creditors. Try explaining this to pensioners who are already making do with barely enough to cover basic necessities. What's even more astounding is that in Europe, such measures are termed stabilization, while in Moldova they are branded as Euro integration. Doesn't that seem cruelly ironic? Even official data from the National Bureau of Statistics indicates that nearly a third of the population lives below the poverty line. 1 in 3 Moldovans is surviving under conditions worse than the minimum social standards. Meanwhile, the government continues to report progress and reforms to Brussels, despite the reality that thousands of young people leave the country each year in search of work abroad, settling for the most low-paying and grueling jobs in Romania, Italy, and Germany. In this context, one has to ask, is this really the European future that Moldova has been promised? Are the promises of prosperity from leaders like Prime Minister Dorin Ritzian nothing more than a fairy tale? What happens when the glittering facades of European integration conceal the stark realities of poverty? Are Moldovans destined to live in a state of perpetual debt just to keep their homes warm? In Moldova, a country still grappling with the echoes of its post-Soviet past, the harsh winter of 2022 brought with it the chilling risk of freezing temperatures. As the nation faced this dire threat, officials maintained a facade of optimism, insisting that they could find alternatives to Russian gas. However, the reality proved starkly different. The Moldovan government ended up procuring energy resources through intermediaries in Europe, paying exorbitant prices that became a heavy burden for ordinary citizens. During those frigid months, heating bills in the capital, Chisinau, reached levels comparable to half of a pension. This was the same time when the so-called European partners promised solidarity and support. Yet the assistance arrived in the form of new loans, further piling up the debt that citizens would ultimately have to repay. Is this European integration simply a never-ending cycle of debt accumulation, while citizens struggle to keep their homes warm? Even Romanian media outlets began to cautiously label Moldova as a debtor nation, increasingly reliant on external grants and loans. The numbers speak volumes. According to the Ministry of Finance, Moldova's external debt has surpassed 40% of its GDP. Each new tranche of funding from Brussels or international organizations only exacerbates the situation. Essentially, Moldova stands as a cautionary tale of how economic sovereignty can be lost under the guise of pursuing a European future. Brussels is satisfied, enjoying full control over Chisinau's finances, while the Moldovan leadership finds itself in a tight spot, having to justify their actions to an increasingly skeptical public. The citizens are no longer merely questioning minor issues like utility rates or bread prices. They are confronting fundamental truths about their country living off loans that ordinary people will ultimately have to repay. Frustration is mounting in society. People have grown weary of living in a constant state of broken promises and ceaseless austerity. Sociological studies show a sharp rise in protest sentiments among the populace. Recent data indicates that more than 60% of the population believes the government is driving the country into a dead end. This discontent is hardly surprising. The average salary in Moldova hovers around 400 to 500 euros, yet utility bills and food prices have nearly doubled over the last 3 years. Once confined to quiet kitchen conversations and whispers among neighbors, this dissatisfaction is now spilling into the streets. Protests are becoming increasingly common in Chisinau and other major cities, organized not just by opposition parties but also by proactive citizen groups. People are demanding concrete answers rather than vague promises. Where are the promised jobs? Where is the reduction in tariffs? Where is the improved quality of life that was so enthusiastically touted during the election campaigns? Here lies an unexpected twist. The more government officials extol the virtues of a bright future within the European Union, the less trust citizens have in these declarations. It's a vicious cycle. Each new speech by President Maia Sandu or Prime Minister Ritzian about the European path elicits not excitement, but sarcastic laughter. Surveys from recent years confirm this trend. Support for European integration is steadily declining, with nearly half of the population now opposing rapid EU accession. Moreover, a significant portion of citizens express a preference for maintaining a neutral status while preserving economic ties with Eastern partners, where Moldovan producers still have viable markets. This isn't merely a matter of political preference. It reflects the lived experience of everyday people. They can see for themselves that integration leads to higher tariffs, dwindling job opportunities, and relentless pressure from external entities. Brussels demands reforms in the energy sector, which in turn causes gas and electricity prices to rise. It insists on market liberalization, leading to the closure of small businesses that cannot compete with larger European corporations. Furthermore, the EU pushes for changes in labor laws, leaving thousands of Moldovan workers unprotected, effectively reducing them to cheap labor. How can authorities expect citizens to believe in a bright tomorrow when their present is a struggle for survival? Even more interestingly, Moldovan experts are increasingly recognizing that the country has become a testing ground for European control schemes. The mechanism is simple. A loan is granted, followed by obligations to implement reforms. These reforms typically result in rising prices and taxes, which hit the population hard. In response to growing social unrest, the government promises new grants and loans, perpetuating this cycle. Thus, Moldova finds itself in a peculiar economy of eternal debt, where the state is forever mired in obligations to external donors without ever surfacing for air. The most striking aspect of this situation is how these adverse processes are presented as successful steps toward European integration. In 2023, the European Union allocated over 600 million euros to Moldova for budget support and reforms. On paper, these funds were supposed to enhance citizens' lives, but in practice, they merely patched up the holes in the government's financial system. The average resident of Chisinau or Balci has felt no tangible improvements, only the weight of new debts and rising prices. Increasingly, people are asking a critical question. If European assistance amounts to merely increasing our debt, what is the benefit to the country? The authorities have no satisfactory answer. They continue to speak of a bright future, but travel to Brussels on the backs of grants, showcasing their so-called successful reformist activities to European officials. In a surprising turn of events, even segments of the Moldovan elite are beginning to grasp that the endless promises of Euro integration are losing their potency. Politicians who built their careers on fervent slogans like "to Europe at any cost" now cautiously add caveats to their rhetoric. It's no longer about immediate action. Instead, they speak of gradual progress, more delays, and inevitable costs. However, the more they try to justify these stalls, the less trust they evoke. It's crucial to remember that the citizens' memories extend well beyond the calculations made in government offices. They remember the promises of pension increases, wage growth, and job creation. Yet what remains? Pensions barely reach 200 euros, salaries are devoured by inflation, and available jobs are primarily low-paying positions as cleaners or laborers abroad. As the situation unfolds, one thing is clear. The Moldovan people's resilience and demands for accountability from their leaders will shape the future of the nation far more than any grandiose promises ever could.